Okay, so now I'm going to talk about particular types of vertebrae, and we're going to have to get through cervical vertebrae, thoracic vertebrae, lumbar vertebrae, the sacrum, and the coccyx. So here goes. So cervical vertebrae. Cervical vertebrae. There are 7 cervical vertebrae, and they are the smallest vertebrae, except for the coccygeal vertebrae, which are really tiny. C1, 2, and 7 are unique, and C3, 4, 5, and 6 are typical vertebrae that are similar to each other. The body of a cervical vertebrae is small because it only needs to support the weight of the head, okay? And even though the head is heavy, the head is not as heavy as the head and the arms and the upper trunk, and then, etc. As the vertebrae support more weight, their bodies become larger. Cervical vertebrae have some characteristic features. The most characteristic feature is that the transverse processes of cervical vertebrae have transverse foramen. And remember, that means holes. So they have transverse holes, okay? So in the transverse processes, there are transverse foramen. No other vertebrae have that feature. This is the most characteristic feature of cervical vertebrae. The vertebral arteries travel through the transverse foramen to the posterior brain. We haven't learned arteries yet, but I included 2 pictures showing you the vertebral arteries. So here's a subclavian artery on the right side, and coming off it is the vertebral artery. I know this doesn't mean much to you right now. And up it goes through the transverse foramen, up, 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 and then it has to pop into the foramen magnum and go to the posterior brain. It's an extremely important vertebra feature because the vertebral arteries are extremely important. Without our posterior brain, we lose the housekeeping functions of the brain. So we lose our drive for respiration, our control of heart rate, our basic consciousness. The posterior brain is extremely important. So the vertebral arteries are extremely important, and the transverse foramen in the cervical vertebrae are extremely important. And marked here in blue, you'll like it better, are the transverse foramen. Okay, C2 to C6 have short spinous processes with a split or bifid tip. That's seen here. The articulations or joints between the cervical vertebrae have a greater degree of motion than do those of other regions of the vertebral column. We can swivel our heads around like when we rubberneck on the highway, that kind of thing. And if we look at the cartoon here, where they're showing important characteristics of the cervical vertebrae, the first one was the transverse foramen in blue, and now we're looking at the bifid spinous process in yellow. The vertebral foramen in the cervical vertebrae is relatively large. This is because at the cervical level, the spinal cord has all of the nerve fibers that are going to travel from the brain to the rest of the body. Therefore, the spinal cord is at its largest. As the diameter of the spinal cord decreases as we go down inferiorly, so does the diameter of the vertebral foramen. It no longer needs to be as large. And here we see another characteristic of the cervical vertebrae, the size of the vertebral foramen shown in green. So I would just like to say, when you are identifying vertebrae, which you will do on your lab exam, you can not go wrong with the one characteristic feature of cervical vertebrae, that they have transverse foramen in their transverse processes. No other vertebrae do. So you don't really need to learn the other 2 if you really just cement in your mind, when you're looking at a single vertebrae and being asked to identify it, that the transverse processes have transverse foramen. So leaving the characteristics of the cervical vertebrae and going on to describe the unique cervical vertebrae. C1 first. C1 has a name. It's called the Atlas. It's named after Atlas, a mythological figure who held up the world. The Atlas does not have a body, just an anterior arch. Okay, so that is unique. It is the only vertebra that does not have a vertebral body. It articulates with the occipital bone at the occipital condyles. The shape of the joint between the atlas and the occipital bone allows forward and back movement of the skull, as in nodding yes. And you can have fun with the skulls in class by holding the C1 atlas to the occipital bones of a skull and seeing that, yes, indeed, you can make the skeleton nod yes. So now looking at the pictures, this is a superior view. This is the anterior, and notice that we have an anterior arch, no body to this vertebra. Then we have the two articular facets, or just the areas that are going to articulate with the occipital condyles. Okay. That's what we've learned about that so far. That orange thing in the middle, the odontoid process, do not be confused. That is part of C2, the axis. It's not part of the atlas, okay? They're just showing it here. And then this is just to orient us again to the occipital bone and the occipital condyles. We're looking from the inferior of the skull. The mandible has been removed. There's that hard palate that we learned, okay? But the important thing is finding those occipital condyles in the occipital bone. Okay, getting to C2, the axis. It has an anterior bony protuberance called the dens or tooth, sometimes called something else called the odontoid process, but we'll not call it that. It's too much. We'll just call it the dens or tooth on the superior part of its body. And there it is in orange. Before in our last picture, it was peeping. The dens. See, they call it the odontoid process, but it's the dens, just another name. And if you look from the side, you can see that it is really a large protuberance. Okay. It looked to them like a tooth, and we can see why they thought that. Okay. The muscles that control the position of the head, the neck, etc., are attached to the spinous process of the axis. Here shown in yellow, the bifid spinous process of the axis. So great, appreciate those pictures. And now things get interesting. There is a transverse ligament on the atlas that wraps around the dens. So we have C1, the atlas, and C2, the axis, and they're going to interact with each other. A transverse ligament on the atlas wraps around the dens. Okay. So in the bone, it's not seen. The ligaments have been removed. But if we look to the right in the picture, there's a ligament called the transverse ligament. And it's on the atlas, and it's wrapped around the dens of the axis bone. And that creates a little loop, and the atlas can spin on the axis. This rotates the skull to the right and the left, as when shaking the head no, okay? Right. And note, there are no intervertebral discs between the atlas and the axis. So the structure of the C1 atlas and C2 axis vertebrae very much is associated with their function. Nodding, yes. Shaking your head, no. Very important. Okay. Our final unique cervical vertebrae is the vertebra prominens. C7, the vertebra prominens, has a very prominent spinous process. This spinous process can be palpated easily and feels like a knob at the base of the neck. We can all feel it if we feel back there. Okay, it's the junction between the cervical curve, which arches anteriorly, and the thoracic curve, which arches posteriorly. There it is. I have an arrow pointing to it on the left, and then on the right, it speaks for itself, the vertebra prominence. Okay, something interesting. The ligamentum nuchae. The ligamentum nuchae is a large, elastic ligament that attaches the occipital bone to the spinous process of the cervical vertebrae. And it attaches to all of the spinous processes, and it ends at C7, vertebra prominence. When the head is upright, this ligament maintains the cervical curve without muscular effort. If the head is bent forward, the elasticity of this ligament helps return the head to an upright position. So pretty cool. It's kind of like free money, okay? The elasticity maintains the cervical curvature without muscular effort. Normally, and when the head is bent forward, the elasticity brings the head to an upright position. So I love this ligament. All right. Clinical correlation, whiplash. The skull is large compared to the vertebral column. It balances on top of the cervical vertebrae, and the position of the skull is changed and stabilized by movements of the muscles in the neck. If a person undergoes a rapid deceleration or acceleration, as in a car accident, the neck muscles may not be strong enough to stabilize the skull. This may result in whiplash, where the skull is suddenly sent backwards in strong extension or suddenly sent forward in strong flexion. This can cause an injury to the neck due to the sudden strain to the ligaments and the muscles in the neck. Okay, thoracic vertebrae. A thoracic vertebra is larger than a cervical vertebra. It has a heart-shaped body, and the T1 through T9 vertebrae have spinous processes that are long and slender and project posterior-caudally. T10, T11, T12 vertebrae have spinous processes that are becoming shorter and straighter and eventually morphing into lumbar vertebrae. But for many of the vertebrae, T1 through T9, you can identify the vertebrae by the spinous processes because they project posterior-caudally more strongly than those of the cervical vertebrae or of the lumbar vertebrae. So if you look at the T1 through the T9 vertebrae, they have spinous processes that are long and slender and project posterior-caudally. And this is such a strong feature that if you're looking at a single vertebra, you can often identify it by this feature alone. The thoracic vertebrae bodies articulate with the ribs. T1 through T10 vertebrae transverse processes also articulate with parts of the ribs. And the thoracic vertebrae articulations with the ribs are limited in mobility because of these two bones lying next to each other. All right, so let's look at this picture over here. Here's a rib, here's a thoracic vertebra, and there is a joint between, an articulation between the rib and the vertebra. The rib articulates with the body of the vertebra and with the transverse process of the vertebra, limiting the mobility of this region of the vertebral column. T1 through T8 vertebrae articulate on their lateral sides with two pairs of ribs. One pair of ribs articulates superiorly, and one pair of ribs articulates inferiorly, whereas T9, 10, 11, and 12 vertebrae articulate with only one pair of ribs. I know we're getting granular here. I just want you to understand how things work in the body. It's not so important, even it's nice to know, but let's say it's not the first thing that you have to understand about the basics of the thoracic vertebrae and the ribs. Nonetheless, let's go over some pictures here. So here's the first thoracic vertebra, and it articulates with the first rib. They're showing you one of the articular surfaces. This one's on the first thoracic vertebra. And then here's another articulation on this first thoracic vertebra for the second rib. So this is how things start and things go on. And here they're showing you the sixth thoracic vertebra, T6 and T7. And here's an articular surface for the sixth rib up above, and then for the seventh rib down below on T6. And here's an articular surface for the seventh rib on T7. There's an articular surface for the eighth rib on T7. And if we look at the one rib that actually is in the joint here, that's the seventh rib. It's partly articulating with T6 and partly articulating with T7, and it's articulating with the transverse process of T7. All right, so supragranular, just I want you to understand how it works and be clear on it. In other words, nothing I would test you on.